I grew up in North Carolina. I graduated from high school in 1959. I came to NC State in 1960. And at that time, the School of Design was just about the only design and artistic game in town in North Carolina. I mean, it was a very special place, but it was, in a sense, a standalone institution. When I returned to North Carolina in 1981, having been away for 20 years and studying and teaching architecture in England and working in New York, it was still pretty much the case that the School of Design was a unique institution. For my own work, when I moved back here in 1981, I had worked for famous architects in both New York and in London. And it was a real challenge to think of how I would actually practice as an architect in North Carolina. I came here wanting to teach and to practice, I should say that. And so my challenge was, well, how do you be an architect in North Carolina when most of the things that are being acknowledged or supported in architecture are happening in Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and Paris? And I decided in the 1980s that I would actually celebrate the fact that I was working in North Carolina. I wouldn't try to be a New York architect or a Los Angeles architect. I was going to be a North Carolina architect. And the more I thought about that, the more rewarding I thought that could be. My primary goal with my students is to get them to trust themselves and who they are. It's very hard to do. As I've said, we all start out learning from other designers, and we tend to think these other designers get their inspiration perhaps straight from heaven. But one of my roles in teaching is to introduce designers, architects, to my students and to get the students to understand that these are people. Every architect had a childhood, every architect went to school, every architect had mentors, every architect grew up in a certain way, and all of those things shaped his or her life and work. And so one of my goals is to empower my students to respect their backgrounds from Elkin, North Carolina, or from Ocracoke, as a great source of design. The academic world in architecture now tends to be dominated by non-practicing faculty, and thus it's become theoretical, involved with linguistics, with mostly esoteric subjects that can only be understood by others in this academic milieu. I'm just not part of that. I don't fit in with that. I'm much more comfortable with talking about how buildings respond to a need and to the dictates of the site and the climate. I actually tell my students that once they graduate, their lives as designers are going to get much easier because they're going to deal with real problems. They're going to deal with how to use daylight in a room where some of the children can't see very well. They're going to learn how to make people feel comfortable when they're in a waiting room at a hospital. And all of these things are very specific challenges. They're not theoretical. They're very specific, and they can draw out the best in their design creativity. At this stage of life, I'm more interested in buildings that draw people together and create a sense of community than I am in doing buildings that stand out and are unique. I think it's natural for young architects when we're younger to want to differentiate ourselves. But now, for example, when I go to London, where my son lives, I find myself just wandering around London and looking at the 17th and 18th century Georgian buildings that are really the fabric that holds that city together and makes it such an incredible place. 20 years ago when I went to London, I would make a beeline for the newest building, the Lloyd's Bank or, the concert hall or whatever. I don't even go to see these now. I'm much happier just strolling around and looking at the way architecture can create a sense of community, gathering, I call it.